Okay. So, well, I think it is the time that we should start. Maybe he will join and, we can get started slowly. So, good afternoon, friends. And on behalf of ISID, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you, including our, three speakers, my colleague, Akhilesh, who will be making a presentation to get us started, and all the participants. I see 42 already on board, and I'm sure some more will be joining. So the discussion for today is about fostering the revival of MSMEs in the aftermath of COVID-19. And we all agree that COVID pandemic has been a devastating and very, very difficult time for all of us, all these, players, all the actors and stakeholders. But MSMEs have been, at the forefront of this impact, adverse impact, in terms of getting a hit, because larger enterprises, bigger enterprises have, greater ability to withstand the shocks that they face, like this. And the small players, and MSMEs are all the smaller players. They are the ones who are hit the worst, and it has been such a long dragging crisis, already 2 years, more than 2 years. If I remember correctly, 30th of January 2020, it was first kind of acknowledged globally. And so it is more than 2 years, and in that long period, many of our MSMEs have really faced a very challenging time, closing down the operations, scaling down the operations, losing some of the manpower, or a lot of upheavals they have faced. And what will it take to revive them and pull out of this mess or the challenging situation they have been in, is the discussion today. And we have three very distinguished speakers, including Professor Keshav Das, who has been doing a lot of research on MSMEs, all different aspects of MSMEs, at his base in Gujarat Institute of Development Research in Ahmedabad, and Professor M.H. Balasubramania at the Indian Institute of Science. He has been constantly producing a lot of work on MSMEs and also startups. And then Professor Devanathan at the Institute of Human Development, who has been writing a lot on the GVCs and Indian links of the global value chains. So we will have, I'm sure, a very, sort of insightful discussion on what can be done to revive these MSMEs after they have faced the onslaught of COVID-19. But before I invite the very distinguished speakers of today, I want to invite my own colleague, Dr. Akhilesh Sharma, who has done a primary survey along with the friend of our collaborator of his, of 225 small firms in two different locations, to find out exactly how they have been facing the onslaught of this pandemic. So once he presents some of his findings from the survey that he conducted, I will invite the three very distinguished speakers to take the floor and share their insights. So with that very brief introduction and welcome to all of you, I want to turn to Akhilesh. Akhilesh, you have the floor. And if you could share your findings in, say, 15 minutes, so that leaves time for...
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yeah.
I will try.
Good. Good. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, sir, for this opportunity, and good evening to everyone. This particularly distinguished speakers and participants. This is the study basically I conducted uh, during the pandemic, second phase of the pandemic. After that, festival season, you can say October to October 2020 to March 2021. With my colleague Dr. Sushil Kumar Rai. Initially, our objective was to cover only the Delhi NCR region, but with his help, we covered the Dehradun and Uttarakhand regions, some MSMEs also. Uh, since Professor Nagesh has already briefed about how the MSMEs has suffered, and we all know about it. So I will directly say that the objective of our this survey was to understand the impact of COVID-19 on MSMEs, to assess the efficacy of government policies in reviving the MSME sector, and to find out ways to enhance the resilience of the sector and promote its sustained growth. The primary data is basically we do a telephonic survey of the small and medium enterprises, semi-structured questionnaire, and our more focus on the qualitative observation, because through the telephone it is difficult to get the responses from the firms if you have the highly structured questionnaires. We use the snowball samplings and duration, as I mentioned, October 2020 to March 2021. The key questions, basically what we focus, we try to understand how the pandemic has affected employment, turnover, investment during this two financial years, 2019 to 2019-20 and 2022 to 2021. Since this was happening during the financial year of 2021 to 2020 to 2021, we asked them for the expected turnover, expected values for the turnover, so that we can compare the values between the 2 years, how it has changed over time. And the other key aspects was the impact of the lockdown on business activities, the plight of workers, how it affected the business activities, challenges they are facing in the survival and the revival, government initiatives and their effectiveness, opportunities during the pandemic, if they have, expectations from the government, and the short and long-term strategies. And based on this interaction, we are trying to find out what could be the possible policy recommendations so that MSMEs can be prepared for the future economic uncertainties if it arises. We use the mixed method of analysis, both qualitative and quantitative data. Around 225 firms we covered, and it represents around 72% of the manufacturing and services, 28% service activities. If you see NIC codes, we have covered around 18 sectors. Mostly manufacture of the food products, manufacture of the rubber and plastic products, recognition, manufacture of the pharmaceuticals, medical, chemicals, botanical products, food and beverages, service activities, specialized construction, etc. But we are focusing our analysis only as a group of MSMEs. We are not going because their numbers are not as large as so it can be the representative of the particular sectors. But we also mention the inferences if you are drawing from the sector specific, if there is some inferences about the sector specific. In this study, we have micro enterprises around 16%, small enterprises 60%, 50%, and medium enterprises around 34%. And all firms are registered. Basically, this is the limitations, right? Because we did it through the telephonic survey and the snowball sampling. We are able to cover only the registered firms. And the composition, if you see the micro, small, and medium enterprises, basically it is not reflecting the true composition of the MSMEs across the MSME populations we have from the NSSO data. But the observations definitely reflect the general observations of the sufferings of the MSMEs, and I hope the findings will be equally applicable to the MSME sectors as a large. The first thing we'll try to understand the implications of changes in MSME definition. As we know that the government changes the definition of MSMEs in its Atmanirbhar Bharat packages. And now the MSMEs are defined in terms of the new composite criteria, which include the investment in plants and machinery and equipment and turnover. Earlier, it was defined only in terms of the investment in plant and machinery and equipments. Services and manufacturing activities are also separately categorized, but here in the new definitions, both have taken together. But there is important change was that upgradation of the limits in terms of the investment in plant and machinery. Why it is important? Because with the basis of that, we can compare how it has the new definitions has changed the categorization of MSMEs across the groups and what is its implication. If you see the bottom tables, it clearly shows that out of 225 firms, we have the 16% the micro enterprises, 40 around 50% the small enterprises, and the 32% the medium enterprises. But with the old criteria, the firms there is no micro enterprises, all were the small, medium, and large enterprises. And this is showing that how this the new definitions, new changes, upgradation of the investment limit is bringing the large enterprises in the category of MSMEs, and now they are able to avail the benefits of the MSMEs. In general, this has no problem if increasing the population of MSMEs. But since MSME comprises the large, the informal sectors, and the financial institutions prefer the MSMEs or enterprises that have the financial documents, so that they can easily monitor and monitor their business prospects, and they can manage it. And small enterprises, the unit cost of giving the loan application processing also very high. So that's why in practice, the banks prefer the slightly the larger enterprises, even in the group of the MSMEs. So if the new large enterprises are coming, so basically they are in the better position to avail the benefits of the that has been the design for the MSME sectors. And the maybe the more needy enterprises would be less preferred during this process. So this was the apprehension. But around the 87% of the MSMEs that we studied, they supported this definition, changes in definition, and particularly in terms of they said that with this we will be able to invest more, and it will increase the production capacity. We will be able to focus more on the exports. So that's why, and even by increasing our size is scaling up, we will be able to avail the benefits of the MSME. So this way they have appreciated it, and the revisionist MSME definition has been welcomed by the MSME groups. And our next point was impact of lockdown on business activities on their in employment. You see clearly around 11% firms, they mentioned that due to the lockdown, their production and distribution activities closed. They were not able to operate. And but around 29%, they mentioned that there is decrease in the production activities, and around 7% mentioned that there was the order cancelled. But and also the around 29%, they mentioned that their demand or businesses collapse. Here, one point I would like to mention that this information is we have not the coded responses in our questionnaire. We observe their responses and then we have make the coded. So that basically this is the multiple response of the from the enterprises. So that's why this is not you cannot say the adding up to the 100, but basically this is showing the importance of the particular impact that the MSME sector has faced. So the first four rows, they clearly says that the huge disruption in their business activities, their demand, their demand has also declined around the 53%. The businesses told that they face the decrease in the demand, and this is clearly shows the severity of this sector has faced. Reduction is in the export, as we know that there was the restriction on the export activities. They also faced the reduction in exports. Interestingly, some firms had mentioned that there was the increase in the demand for that. And when we tried to see more in the data and try to find out the sectors, they were the sectors that is related to the pharmaceuticals and health activities and the manufacture of the operants. Basically, these are the enterprises, they have the more demand in the, during that time, particularly the wearing of the masks and PPE kits and some other related activities. So, and some other enterprises also, they were not able to operate their own businesses. They switch over for these activities with their existing financial resources and the labor and the channels, distribution channels, they operated it. But these are the sectors where there is the increase in demand. Delayed payments was also very important issues, and around 17% firms faced the delayed payment. The erratic supply of raw materials, this was another very serious. Even I think that after the decrease in demand, the erratic supply of raw material was under the very significant and important problem they faced. Decrease in imported raw materials and increase in prices of raw materials. The increase in prices of raw materials, the problem they mention that basically some of the firms, they made the cartels, and during that process the prices of the raw materials increased. Even the problem of the supply chain network disruption was there, but the carteling among the businesses was also another problem that was the cause of the increase in prices. And other problem was the quality of the raw material. Since there was huge demand for the raw material to explore the business opportunities and meet the increased demand, the quality of the raw material was also another problem that these businesses faced due to the lockdown. And if you see its impact on the employment, and see there are total around 25% decline in the employment among these firms. And earlier, if you see there were the 34,000, more than 34,000 workers were employed, while in the 2020-21 around 26,000 workers were employed. So there is the changes is around 25%. That is, but mostly it is coming from the informal segments, informal workers, those who were employed, because it happens because due to the sudden lockdown, most of the workers they returned back to their villages, so they were not available for the works, and there were the business uncertainties that when the businesses will start. So this was also in the reason that informal workers moved back to their villages. But interestingly, if you see, there is increase in the employment of the formal workers. Here, I would like to mention that this is not the story of the formalization of the enterprises. Basically, since all the firms are registered, so I am talking about the formal employment and informal employment issues in the businesses. So here in the formal employment, we ask them that we want to understand the formal employment means the duration, the longevity of the employment, as well as the other social security benefits, whether you are providing it or not. So this around 49% firms, they mentioned that we employed 2, 3, 5, 6 around some very small formal workers to meet our business commitments. The first business commitments and the explore the new business opportunities if there is any. So so they employed a few workers, but these workers were the skilled workers, only the skilled workers. And another important feature was that workers were also looking for the employment, so they were ready to get the employment, formal employment at slightly the lower wages. So this was the phenomenon that has happened during the crisis, during the pandemic, when both workers and employers were facing the challenges, and both were benefited with the formal employment at the formal employment at the slightly lower wages. Workers get at the certainty of the employment with the long duration and other benefits, and for firms get the committed workers and to meet their business commitment. So this was the new phenomenon, and I hope that the distinguished speakers and other participants can also throw light on these aspects, how to understand more and whether we can generalize these aspects or not. But this clearly shows the business opportunities, or you can say opportunity for the both workers and employer during the crisis, and they have availed it. some of the workers, family workers, they also increased. Basically, these are the workers, they were working in other firms, and due to the lockdown, they have returned back. And during this period, they joined their own businesses, and they were helping. So this was the reason of that. But it's true that in terms of employment, this sectors was very severely affected, and very huge unemployment problem was there, and particularly in the segment of the informal workers. Sorry. If you see the terms in terms of the impact, the second table basically clearly see that around 90% firms in our sample, they reported that they faced the decline in their turnover. And but interestingly, around 10% firms, they are saying that there is increase in their turnover, or there is no change in turnover. Basically, these were the enterprises who are engaged in the pharmaceuticals, health-related activities, wearing apparels, and other sectors do have some demand during this pandemic, and they were able to cope up with the initial resources, financial resources, and their workers, their skilled workers. So, but their number is less, but this has happened. And these pictures we have also realized from the other studies also, that there was business opportunities for some sectors during the pandemics, and they have explored, they have availed this opportunity. But if you see that around 17% firms face the up to the 25% decline in their turnover, but and around 53% firms face the decline in their turnover more than 50%. So there is the huge decline in turnover, and this is again reflecting that how severely this sector has been affected by the pandemic, and how the difficult challenges they were facing during the pandemic. If we see these changes in the turnover, we see that's the average changes. I have seen that small enterprises and the micro enterprises were more affected by the pandemic, and it has been reflected in terms of their decline in their average turnover. In terms of the medium enterprises, their impact is relatively less, but this is not much less. But if you see the maximum value of the range of the decline, range of changes in turnover, you see some for some segment it is the 25%. So basically, these are the enterprises, they have faced either increase in the turnover or the no change in turnover. So if we link this, it was the medium enterprises. They were able to better cope with the challenges of the pandemic, and they have relatively better performed during the pandemic period. And perhaps probably this is the reason that why we have seen the relatively larger firms, some of the larger firms have gained more during the pandemic, and some of the recent studies we have found that large firms has gained more during the pandemic. The reasons for decline in the turnover that we see, that the most important reason that we observe is that it is restriction on the economic activity. Basically, it is reflecting the lockdown and lockdown. And so this is the lockdown and sudden lockdown that has affected the performance of this small and medium enterprises. And other reason was the decrease in the demand. And this we can link with the disruption in the market, basically the restriction on the transport and other things, as well as the employment aspect, because many people has lost their jobs, and that's why due to the uncertainties their demand has declined. And so this was the reason that we have there is the decrease in the demand, and shortage of raw materials was also under major reason. Restriction in the mobility and social gathering, slow recovery in the market, restriction on trade, delayed in payment, basically the return from businesses we are not able to get the timely returns, labor shortage, increase in the labor cost, and increase in the cost of production. These are the top 10 reasons that we have listed. There are some other reasons, but we are only listing it top 10, clearly see that the reasons of the declining turnovers was related to one, the lockdown, and other is the demand, and other is related, we can link with the delay in the payments and the labor shortages. So these are the reasons that we can think, and we can also keep in mind of deriving some policy for the resilience of these businesses. The challenges of these businesses faces in the revival, and that is the important challenge was in the working capitals they face, and the major challenge due to the rising inventory and the delayed payment. They were not able to sell their produced goods, and they are not able to get the timely repayment. So they were not able to manage the working capital related expenses. And other challenge was that the loan and interest payment issues. Since the return was less and they were not able to get the income on time, so they were also facing the challenges. And they clearly mentioned that the issues of the government policies, that the loan moratorium and loan restructuring schemes were quite helpful for them. And they were also suggested that such type of scheme should be continued for the long time. And they suggested that it may take 2 to 3 years for the revival of their business, so governments to continue it for up to the 2 to 3 years. Investment also, since the business environment was not conducive, so there was disruption, uncertainty, and demand was less. So they were not very much interested for the interest. Even some government initiatives was there for them to take the loans, but they were not very much interested due to the business uncertainty and reduced demand. They also lack their own finances, because some of the business enterprises, those they have the funds, they invested, and they even tried to switch over to related activities that have the demand during the pandemic. And even they were able to hire the few workers, skilled workers, they can meet their required demands. But they were also more relying on their own finances, given the uncertainty in the market. So she lacks it. So that's why majority of the businesses were not coming forward for the new investments, and lack of planning for uncertainties. All the firms clearly mentions that they don't have any plan for such things. But if you see the studies literature, or even the literature related to disaster management, we clearly find that the large firms have some planning to face these uncertain times. So that's why when such conditions arises, they were better placed to face such challenges. So this was the other major issues pertaining to small and medium enterprises. As we discussed, the supply of raw materials was another major challenge. Supply chains was disrupted, prices of raw materials was increased, and the quality of even the raw materials were available, but the quality issues were there. And some of the suppliers were hoarding, and some of the suppliers had made the cartels, and that's why the prices of raw materials has increased. Even imports.
Can you please wrap up quickly now?
Yeah, yes, sir, I'm done. Yeah. And another challenge was the workers, the shortage of the workers, and that's at least increase in the cost of production, as you also mentioned, the demand for the production services. About the government schemes, we try to gather information about the awareness level of business benefits received and satisfied. In general, their awareness levels are very high. But if you see the benefits received and satisfaction, except the few like the MSME 59, their performance is not very impressive. So that's why it requires that there is need to make the revise the schemes that can meet the demands of the businesses, small businesses, and particularly. But all the businesses have appreciated the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan and that related schemes, but they are suggested that this scheme should continue for the long durations. That the lessons what we have learned for the resilient and sustained growth. As it is clear that the pandemic has generated both demand and supply side, but the government initiatives was mainly that is the financial related assistance, particularly for the small and medium enterprises. But they clearly accepted that this assistance can help them to survive but they cannot help them to revive and sustain their growth. So that's why government should focus on focusing on demand aspects also, and that was the another the biggest challenge they face. The government stimulus packages should address the local and sectoral needs of the firms. As I mentioned, that the MSME sectors are highly diverse sectors, and so umbrella policies cannot work. So there is a need for the local policies also, particularly the state governments should come forward and address these concerns, given their local needs of the small and medium enterprises. As we see the high awareness of the government policy, so government should among the registered firms, so government should increase the registration of the firms, and registered firms have better access, better awareness, better access to these programs. Resilience of the firms depends upon its financial resources, and as we understand that those who have resources, they were able to better place to face the challenges, and their ability to invest in new technology, particularly the e-commerce and the other new technology, technology that is related to the new business opportunities. So only they have the ability, only they can have the better resilience power. So these are the lessons that we are learning, and that clearly shows that MSME sector should plan for these uncertainties. And as you see that the three major challenges they face, that is the lack of financial resources, skilled workforce, and scarcity of demand. The two they can manage themselves, and they can do it for their better planning. And for that, we are suggesting the two financial plannings, basically two provisions for of the emergency funds for the MSME sectors. One is like that we have the PPF fund, and PPF funds is the small saving funds for the workers, and even the individual can also invest in that. So with this PPF fund, people prepare for the uncertain times in their lives in the future. So here also for the small MSME segments, we can think for there should be a kind of some corpus fund, uncertainty corpus fund for the small businesses to meet the business requirements during the uncertain times, and we can link with their turnover. Here I would like to say for example the 1%, and if up to the 1% of their turnover they can invest in that. If it is their investment in increasing 1% of their turnover, that fund they can use for their investment, their meeting the business demand, and government can have the assured return in that and government can also pay a certain amount of this part of the investment in that. And since their huge MSME sector around 64 million, so government can cap it, and it can link put a limit that up to certain turnover MSMEs will be participate in that. Another excellent opportunities for the insurance sector, that the term insurance for the small businesses, and this like that we have the term insurance, we can also have the term insurance for the small businesses, and it's a huge potential. And here also MSM government can have some cap on their turnover, and government can also bear the part of the premium, and that can be the good incentive initiative for the particularly the micro enterprises and the informal sector. And it will also help the government in time of crisis, because the government will not need to focus for the financial need of the MSME. Government will focus on the demand aspect, and I think that will be the better plan for preparing for the MSME sector. And this is our proposition, and I hope the input from the experts and the other discussions on this. And so this is the conclusion. A last slide. We said the MSME sector has fairly affected, and majority of the firms found the revision and definitions beneficial for them. Although the firms aware about the many schemes, availing benefits of these schemes is not very impressive, and all firms suggested to continue support measures. Government should increase the registration, and government should also focus on addressing the demand aspects of the firms. And resilience of the firms depends upon the financial resources and ability to invest in the new technology and business opportunities. This should be the motto and focus of the preparation for the future uncertainties. And just we are proposing that the government, that there should be some uncertainty fund, corpus fund for SME, and small insurance business schemes. And this should start since beginning, that when the firm registered, government should encourage them to come forward and make them mandatory to come forward. That. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Akhilesh, for sharing not only the results of your survey, but also looking into what can be done to make MSME sector more resilient. I mean, agriculture sector, for instance, government has started this crop insurance. So why not something like that for MSME sector, which is highly vulnerable? So thank you very much for thinking about what can be done. Now with that, I must turn to our three experts, Professor Keshav Das. And in the meanwhile, I'm told Professor Devanathan has also joined. So welcome, Professor Devanathan. We were in the beginning looking for you, but we started because time was running out. So welcome, and I will come to you. In this sequence which is given in the announcement for this seminar. So over to Professor Keshav Das. As I introduced earlier, he has been a big champion of MSMEs and has been researching and writing extensively on MSMEs from his base at the GIDR in Ahmedabad. Over to you, Professor Das.
Thank you so very much, and this is a great privilege for me not to be just amongst a very interesting audience, but also very specialized scholars. And as my co-panelists, I see two of my very respected professors, both Professor Devanathan and Professor Balasubramaniam. I know them very well, very personally, and they have been working quite hard. So I'm also looking forward to learning from them about a sector about which I think quite a bit has already been told about Dr. Akhilesh in his presentation. But then I think before we go to the pandemic, and I would rather pose two small points, and the first relates to what we may call as the pre-existing vulnerabilities of this sector. So even with or without the pandemic, so MSMEs had remained a very, very neglected sector. Let me use that strong word, because I presume that this might also be heard in the policy circles as well. And I'm talking about a particular concern that I may just very briefly and simply describe as the missing micro. It is not, I'm not much worried about the missing middle, as very often scholars talk about, but we are talking about a sector in which, despite all the data issues, more than 99% of the units are what we may call as micro enterprises, whether they are rural or urban based, or whether they are employing workers or not, whether they are mostly OAMEs, the own account manufacturing enterprises or not. I think so. The micro, if we are talking in terms of intervening in the MSME sector, if you are worried about what happened to them during the pandemic and how they were devastated, I don't think that we miss out on more than 99% of a sector and talk about a small proportion. And the second point relates to my very strong point about this overemphasis on providing finance, or let's say working capital, to be very precise, as if that is the solution to this sector. So these are the two things. So one is the kind of missing micro focus, both in scholarship and in policy. This has really disturbed me for decades that I have been working on this sector. I think we have really missed out. And the other thing which everybody else knows and has been a matter of great concern, and the policy is yet to address that we have a huge data problem. And the latest census of MSMEs were done in 2006-07, and for 18 consecutive years, we saw the number of units growing at a providential rate of 4.07. That is the official statistics showing from 1990 to 2006, when we introduced the medium category. And since then, you have suddenly come up with 2015-16 on the 73rd NSS round data, which we have been using the on incorporated enterprises data. And even today, the annual report of the MSME ministry shows between 2015-16 and 2020-21, you have exactly 63.39 million units and exactly 110.99 million people are employed in this sector. So nothing has changed all these 6-7 years. So we know nothing about how many enterprises are there in this sector, but we have come all the way to discuss about what we can do for this sector. So this I say with great concern, and also about the registration part, which Achilles did describe in great detail. So the registration or the formalization of the informal units, if you like. I'm sure you have this Udyam portal with us, and sort of by the data as in the annual report of 2020 or 21-22, and that's the information we have. So this is just about 10.29% of the enterprises who have ever registered under this portal. So we have actually systematically sort of sidelined the micro. We have sort of systematically not been talking about the informal units which populate this sector, but then we are here to discuss about the policy measures, and we probably I think this is wrong to celebrate any financial stimuli that we are discussing right now. In fact, if you take the Mudra Scheme, about which again Achilles did mention, and he was also saying that this is not one of those very well taken or well used schemes. Since, I mean, my information sort of shows that since 2019 onwards, and since it started in 2015, so from 2019 onwards, there has been a steady decline in the number of accounts and the amount disbursed, despite the fact that there has been an increase in the sort of per capita disbursement of loan under this scheme. So that simply suggests maybe relatively larger of the MSMEs, they have been probably taking the benefit of the so-called Mudra Scheme, which was actually directly meant for the micro and, let's say, informal units. So I want to put this on record because that's a very, very important starting point for me. And the next point relates obviously to this kind of the field survey that Achilles has done during a kind of difficult time. But I thought whether he should have probably also seen some more. Let me just quickly. I think I pasted a number of about 6 or 7 references of studies done by different agencies, including the IIT Madras, including ISB in Hyderabad, RBI, and several agencies, Scotch Foundation. So I've given a list in the chat box right now. So please have a look at that. And many of them, in fact, sort of suggest that what really happened during the pandemic, and many of that we have, in fact, listed in terms of the disruption of the supply chains, in terms of really sort of many of these sort of units would not sort of access many of the financial schemes that were announced. In fact, several of the studies, and there are several newspaper reports, if you follow them, so they do suggest that many of these sort of schemes that were suggested, they were not picked up by the smaller units because it involved a lot of paperwork, and sort of there was a lot of confusion about this. So I think if we are really serious about MSMEs, we must look into that specific information, that who all have taken and what is the category to which they belong. The next point is relating to on what kind of exports that we are talking about. We are world class, etc., etc., and with more than 8,000 products. We have kind of an export data which is probably no longer available at a disaggregated level from 2008-9, and that is a sector that we're talking about in 2022. And I think this basic information about the sector, the number, the employment, the exports, I think all that is extremely essential, and maybe at a further disaggregated level. And in terms of what we might be sort of doing for this sector, I mean, the pandemic has definitely affected very deeply We also saw what happened to the workers, about which we did not say very much. So I would sort of imagine that when you're talking about this sector, maybe one of the last small points that I would make is that not to see MSMEs as a sectoral issue actually. So this has to be sort of placed in a larger context of this space, not place, the space within which they function. So unless you are talking in terms of rescaling the space, whether for sort of like in terms of going in for a kind of new forms of industrial organization, or in terms of like promoting trade or finding newer markets. So unless you are sort of talking in terms of that, that is basically providing certain kinds of basic business support infrastructure, as you may actually probably find in a state like Gujarat, I mean, as Professor Nagesh Kumar was initially mentioning. In fact, you would see actually the local state, I mean, and the industry associations, they have come in a big way in sort of making sure that certain basic business support infrastructure, whether they are roads, whether there's sort of electricity, whether there is water, whether sort of like improving the ports. So all that definitely mattered. And the last small point, which again which sort of links to what I said in the beginning about the missing micro, relates to a complete silence about discussions on what we may very crudely or very broadly call as rural industries, or rather rural industrial clusters in many cases, and this entire craft and artisan based enterprises, sort of who are there everywhere. If you are talking about sort of generating employment, if you are talking of sort of taking them to the world market, as Thailand has done, for instance, as Malaysia has done, for instance, through a variety of incentives that the state and the non-state agencies are provided. So we must necessarily rethink about all these activities which have been there based on traditional knowledge, and also in terms of providing certain kinds of key infrastructure, and particularly, let me mention electricity as one of the key, electricity for the enterprises, whether they're in rural or urban areas. So unless we take a kind of a view as like that, we'll always be discussing about, actually by default, we'll be discussing about the relatively larger of the MSME enterprises. In fact, one of the most recent, in fact, only maybe yesterday or day before yesterday, I see a study by Radhika Kapoor, a working paper, and sort of like she again trying to build up what you call a sort of new statistics from 2000 to 2015-16, taking both formal and informal sources. But then she is missing out on what she's calling as more than 85% of the OAMEs from the analysis, because they are probably more defined as subsistence enterprises and not transformative enterprises. If you are focusing on sort of transformative enterprises, and if you're talking about a policy input, we better talk in terms of what we can do to transform the subsistence enterprise into a dynamic one. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor Das. I think you drew attention to the pre-existing vulnerabilities of MSME sector, and in particular, your emphasis on how the missing micro and rural enterprises, that is a very important dimension we need to pay attention to, because they populate the vast bulk of the MSME sector. So we need to be very sensitive to what the micro and rural enterprises are facing, and try to accommodate or adjust or address their concerns. So with that, let me turn to our second speaker, that is Professor M.H. Bala Subramania at the Indian Institute of Science, and very extensively researching and writing on MSMEs and small businesses, including startups. So over to you, Professor Bala.
Thank you, Professor Nagesh Kumar. I would like to share a PPT
Sure.
with all of you. And so this is how I have titled my brief presentation. I would like to focus on the current challenges and the policy imperatives. I'm not going to introduce the sector to this audience, well-informed audience. But all that I would like to say is the MSME sector has grown in magnitude in terms of every macroeconomic variable worth mentioning. It could be number of enterprises, employment, exports, investment, production. And Professor Keshav Das has already made reference to the statistics, and I would like to draw your attention to this distribution of MSMEs as projected by the Government of India prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the issue is, I strongly suspect that this distribution would have undergone a severe disruption. Now, the first, why it should undergo a severe disruption? First one is the revised definition of MSMEs. Now, the newly introduced definition of MSMEs, the question that arises is whether it is applicable retrospectively or prospectively. When I did some internet search, I found a description from a chartered accountant who has given a legal angle, and he has interpreted that the definition should be applicable retrospectively. Then the disruption is all the more. Because my contention is a good number of large enterprises which are operating, which have emerged and operating beyond the MSME sectoral definition, now a good number of them would have got into this particular sector. And a number of medium-scale enterprises would have come under small-scale enterprises. And a substantial number of small-scale enterprises would have come under micro-enterprises. And micro-enterprises, anyway, they account for a substantially large majority of the total enterprises. But the fact is that is the second factor which is causing disruption. A significant proportion of micro enterprises, particularly in urban India, have been virtually wiped out. So this is the reason, second reason why the distribution would have actually got disrupted. Thirdly, a good number of SMEs would have suspended their operations and the employers would have become employees. Now, that also explains the reason why the distribution, even in terms of employment, it would have got disrupted. There is another factor which actually would have caused disruption in terms of the employment distribution of MSMEs. A good number of particularly small and medium enterprises, they have actually gone for the adoption of labor substitute technologies. So all these would have actually caused a disruption. But then we have no clue how the sector, how big is the sector is, or to what extent the sector has shrunk. Now, most of you may be knowing, let me draw your attention to the key findings of the ILO study conducted on India recently, more or less the same period during which Dr. Akhilesh has carried out his survey. Now, I'm not going to read all these points, but I would like to draw your attention to some of the key findings which I feel should be seriously looked at. The third one, it says in October 2020, 75% of the surveyed enterprises had started normal operations, but 10% working partially and 14% still shut down. Please note, this study was conducted with reference to Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and UP, three major frontline states of our country. Now, 93% of the respondents agreed that the closure impacted them. And then the next important issue is 45% of the enterprises laid off workers either temporarily or permanently. Then the last one on the first column, enterprises not engaging any labor increased from 5% in March 2020 to 17% in October 2020, which really had a severe impact on employment generation. And look at Maharashtra, 20% of the enterprises reported permanent closure. Then the next issue is 39% workers lost their entire source of income. Now, these are the very disturbing developments that have been observed with respect to better industrialized two states, or rather better industrialized states of our country. Now, given these disturbances, what are the major challenges? I would like to list out these challenges. The first one is to ascertain the magnitude of damage caused to the MSME sector by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have good number of regional survey-based studies, including the ILO, but then it is like telling the four blind men to touch different parts of the elephant and describe the elephant. It is very unlikely that we will get a comprehensive picture of the damage that has been actually done to the sector by the COVID-19 pandemic. The second one is to understand how far the supportive policy measures introduced by the central and state governments have addressed the key concerns of the sector. So because again, we do not have any clue. Surveys indicate something in different regions, but again, they do not give a total picture. The third one is to find out what more needs to be done to ensure the sector gets back to the track of pre-COVID-19 pandemic growth, or whether at all we'll be able to put the MSME sector on the original track of growth that is now prior to the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these are the very, what I would say, the serious concerns of the sector, which have to be addressed as early as possible. Now, the subsequent 4 points are rather of medium-term or long-term nature. How to enable a growing proportion of the unorganized MSMEs to become organized MSMEs. Dr. Akhilesh and Professor Keshav Das both have touched upon this issue, but then we cannot deal with this overnight. It has to be a process, maybe in the medium to long run, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Now, fifth one, how to promote interfirm linkages between MSMEs and large enterprises, including MNCs. Now, this is important because several empirical studies, even in the Indian context, have brought out that interfirm linkages lend some kind of it's a source of strength to the MSMEs, both in difficult times and also in normal times. So promoting it brings multiple benefits, provides better market access, enables them to undertake innovation, and it even leads them to the international market. Now, that's precisely for that reason, the sixth issue is how to promote R&D and technological innovations in the sector for the benefit of, for their own benefit, as well as for the benefit of the country as a whole. Now, because even in times of crisis, earlier times also, we have observed that innovative enterprises are able to tide over the crisis relatively better than the non-innovative enterprises. And the last point is how to facilitate a larger proportion of MSMEs to penetrate the international market and join the global value chains of MNCs. Now, given these challenges, I would like to make certain policy recommendations. The first one I would say is conduct an MSME census at the earliest and make it periodic with an interval of about 5 years. I would even go to the extent of telling that the government of India, it is high time to bring out a white paper on the current status of MSMEs in the country. Second one, to revitalize, it is extremely important to revitalize the defunct DIC network across the country to understand the extent of damage done to the MSME sector by the COVID-19 crisis. Third one is to seek inputs from district level MSME associations and chambers of commerce to understand the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and that of support government policies. And the fourth one, provide concessional finance or subsidy based on, in other words, link it to employment and or production and or export contributions relative to that, that have been from these, that have emerged from these enterprises during 2017 to 19. There's no point in distributing arms to everybody, every small scale enterprise. Again, Dr. Akhilesh has indicated that it is not that every MSME has suffered. There are some who actually gained, who would have grown further. So not necessary, link it to the sufferings that they have undergone, relative to the period, pre-COVID period. That would actually give better direction to policy implementation. And the fifth one that I would like to say is promote small finance banks in all rural areas across the country. According to RBI statistics, only 18% of the small finance banks are confined to or concentrated in rural India, whereas 51% of the MSME, that is micro, small and medium enterprises, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic were located in rural India. In other words, a large predominantly a large proportion of the small finance banks were concentrated in metros, large cities, and semi-urban areas, whereas their role is all the more important in rural India. Now, those are the 5 important policy measures which have to be looked into at the earliest. Now, the subsequent 3 measures are fairly in long-term nature. So, build innovation ecosystems in all MSME regional clusters to enable them to carry out innovations. Cultivate MSME academic institute partnerships through collaborative projects. Now, this I have been repeating. This is this has emerged from some of my earlier studies. I felt it is appropriate to bring it to the attention of the knowledgeable audience to think about it and to react. And the last one is create an exclusive innovation finance corporation with branches in all major clusters to fund both high-risk radical innovation and low-risk incremental innovation projects of MSMEs. I personally feel this would give a better direction for MSMEs in our country in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bala Subramania. Not only for drawing our attention to the ILO study, which corroborated the findings of the survey conducted by Akhilesh and his colleague or collaborator, but also putting on the table, number of insightful recommendations to address the challenges that MSMEs face. And I think some of the ideas that you have put on the table are very, very imaginative and creative. And I'm sure we should push them collectively together to draw the attention of policymakers to address the challenges that MSMEs are facing. Now, with that, let me turn to Professor Devanathan. Professor Devanathan has been a visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development and has been very renowned for his work on GVCs and the Indian chains in the global value chains. So with that, over to you, Professor Devanathan.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, and congratulations to Akhilesh and the IISD for the study they have done. However, along with that, I would just like to raise 2 points, actually, in a way, following up from what Keshav Das said. I think that our understanding or analysis of, well, first of all, let's call it a recession. Why are we calling it pandemic? Pandemic is the medical term, but economically, what is it we have seen? We have seen a recession. So why don't we call it a recession and not say pandemic? We may call it pandemic-induced recession, but it's not just the medical factor that led to recession, it's also the policy of the government that led to or intensified the recession as they refused to increase expenditure, particularly to the lowest sections of the working class and to the unorganized sector, what we call unorganized enterprises across various sectors. That's one. Secondly, I think we need to make 2 methodological amendments, changes. First of all, we have to look at the urban-rural connection. The urban areas we think of as, okay, the rural areas, they give us food, we provide all kinds of materials for them, manufacturers, garments, etc. But there's so much more. And the pandemic and the recession showed this to us. When urban employment collapses, we saw all the workers leaving the cities, but where did they go? We went to the villages. And what happened in the villages? Did we see what happened in the villages? No, we didn't look at what was happening in the villages. We really have hardly any reports and hardly any studies of this. That's the first point. Secondly, methodologically, what about the household? Are all of these enterprises, particularly the small and micro enterprises, are they just a matter of the individual employers and employees? Or do their households also have a role to play in the functioning of these enterprises? For instance, I see a question which is missing over there too. One, was there an increase in debt as a result of the recession? Did the debt to turnover ratio go up in these, particularly the smaller enterprises? And secondly, what was the coping strategy? How did they manage? What did they do to keep themselves and their enterprises afloat? I know that some of them had their wives sell their gold. And that is how they managed to meet their expenses, because no bank credit was coming, no government support was coming, except, well, some people got 500 rupees, some got 1,000. And of course, there was the free distribution for the workers. But as far as micro enterprises went, or small ones also in the rural areas, there were no such support. They just had to manage on their own, which was our government's policy, that let the market, you manage with the market, and it's your job to manage whatever you can do. So, well, I did do a study on this, on the impact of COVID. And in fact, it goes back to a study I did a long time ago, which was in '98, when the financial crisis hit the Southeast Asian countries. At that time, I was working with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And everybody said, look, you know, the crisis is an urban crisis. So why are you people dealing with rural development worried about it? So we looked into it and we said, look, what happens to the workers who lose their jobs? They go back home, and how do they manage? It is their rural households of left behind women who manage to keep them alive. And plus we saw another very interesting connection. As the urban unemployment goes up, rural clearing of forests goes down, it also increases. So the more the urban unemployment, the greater the clearing of land, of forests for agricultural land. And then when the urban employment goes up again, or unemployment goes down, then the clearing of land goes down. So there's a connection even between the environment and between the rural and the urban areas. So I did a study along with my colleague Rahul from TISS and some other help from other researchers, which we did for the ILO. Fortunately, we were able to look at, we said, okay, we will look at the food value chains. You know, the government had a very peculiar statement in the beginning, essential services. Food production was not included in essential service. There was nothing about it. So farmers had no idea, police had no idea, and police just stopped everybody moving, even those who were moving to be able to do their agricultural operations. Of course, as when we spoke to some people, they said, well, large farmers who were carrying, you know, the first lockdown came at the time of the Rabi harvest, the harvest and marketing. So he said, large farmers had no problem because we went in tractors and nobody stopped us. But the small farmer who went on it with used a trailer, they were beaten up and not allowed to take their produce to the market. They were told, look, you know, nobody is allowed to move. The government had nothing on what to do for the food value chains, which are so critical to our economy. Anyway, having looked at this, then this is where also what Keshav said about the micro. Look, I think it's ought to, first of all, these are not sectors. We can't talk about an MSME sector. They go across sectors. They go across every sector. MSME enterprises, the unorganized enterprises don't comprise sectors. They grow across sector. But they are a segment of every sector. So the when we looked at we looked really at these micro enterprises. What did we see? First, we looked across a number of states. It was a qualitative study. It was not enough time and not enough money to carry out a big quantitative study. We looked at parts of Kerala, UP, Bihar, and Haryana. So we were able to get a cross-section of different kinds of areas that receive migrant workers and areas that provide migrant workers. We will have to look at both of them. And many of these migrant workers are also in what we will call, they are in micro enterprises, small vegetable sellers of food provided on the street. You know, I live very close to this what's called the Cyber City, which is the hub for the IT industry in Gurgaon. And the first thing you see is that all those, you know, the taxi drivers vanished because they were no longer ferrying all the IT professionals to and from their job. And along with the taxis vanishing, all the street food also vanished because there's no customers. And now even after they have come back, the taxis have not really come back as they were. And there are very few street vendors, but there are many street vendors, actually. It's a very peculiar situation. The numbers of street vendors have not gone down. Their turnover has gone down. Each street vendor is now what we will call a sharing of poverty. Anyway, so with this collapse in Gurgaon and in Kerala, which are receiving areas for workers, of course, the workers went home, and including these micro enterprise operators. That's what when I use work, I'm here referring to the micro enterprise operators. And from Patna, they also went back to rural Bihar. They used up their savings to return home and stay alive. When they tried to come back, they had no working capital when there was some kind of recovery and they were allowed to move back. But they had also sold a lot of their little equipment they had. Somebody has a thela with which you go and sell in Patna, and now you had to sell it because you had nothing to eat. Or you sold the gas stove you had to cook on the street, and you sold the utensils you had. So they lost their capital, they lost their financial capital, and they now, and it's surprising, and a lot of workers also, as Akhilesh's data shows, and all data show, many workers have lost their jobs. And these micro enterprises are actually the fallback option of those who lose their jobs. I was very surprised to note in Gurgaon, in the Sabji Mandi, they said there are many more workers now, many more selling vegetables here than there were before the recession. Why? Because they don't have jobs. And this is the one thing that you can do with a small amount of capital. At least you can manage to eat for yourself, get enough money for yourself if you can't manage to support your family, which anyway, they don't live with them. But not having any credit, having lost all their capital, they had to buy on credit and with higher prices. So this is the default option which we saw. Micro enterprises as the default for not having employment. Those who have been laid off from garment factories, those who have been laid off from all of the enterprises in the Gurgaon area, they have all gone into these little micro enterprises. And as Akhilesh pointed out, this is mainly the informal or the contract labor who have lost their jobs. I mean, the low-level workers in the urban areas are mainly single migrants and single male migrants. They depend on their families of the left behind women to support them in crisis. When they are not well, they go back there. And when the recession hits, that's where they go back. And what did they do? They, of course, reduced consumption. They reduced particularly the more expensive, nutritious food. They postponed medical treatment because they could not afford anything. They increased the burden on women, who now had to do much more of the unpaid work with many more, all the men went back, the children at home. So now the woman has to do so much more work. So they sold their jewelry. Therefore, the lack of social security, which is endemic in India and across Asia also, right across them. And as I said, we saw that even in the 98 crisis. At that time itself, the Thai Prime Minister had said, look, we have a automatic safety mechanism. What is that? Women in the rural areas. So that's how they portrayed, that's how they posed it. But of course, now we don't say such things so bluntly. We're a little more sophisticated in how we say that. But this is exactly what happened, is that the women in the rural areas are the safety mechanism for the loss of employment in the urban areas. And that's what we saw happening. And with this, as again, Keshav pointed out, look, or I think even Dr. Subramaniam's statement data also pointed, the number of micro enterprises with no workers has gone up from something like 4% to maybe 15 or 18% within a space months. So, I mean, they can't afford to feed themselves. How are they going to have workers? And these are people also, as we saw here, those who have lost their jobs in the factories, their escape, their one default option is now to become a small seller of vegetables or fruits or something else on the street. So I would therefore like to just make a couple of points in conclusion. One is that, look, we need to look at the urban-rural connection. We are being methodologically incorrect if we only look at the urban centers and don't see what happens when they go back, because that does not tell us how the recession works out in the economy. Secondly, we also need to go beyond the enterprise or the worker to the household, which particularly means bringing women into the discussion, because they are the ones who really bore the brunt of the social security, of the lack of a safety net, which became very obvious in this recession. So I would just conclude by saying that, look, we need to broaden the way in which we look at this recession, and also look at why are we having what everybody is calling a K-shaped recession. Why is the recovery being K-shaped? Because as I pointed out, look, those workers who have lost their jobs, the workers who were contract labor, the micro enterprise operators who have completely been pauperized by this in the last 1.5 years. Even the small farmers have lost a lot of their gold and had forced to sell. I mean, I was very surprised at seeing why is the gold market going away. In a situation like this, you should expect that there would be some effect on the gold market. So we spoke to some jewelers to ask, who are the people selling you gold? And they said, look, all the small traders, the small farmers, these little enterprise operators, they're all selling gold. First, they come and mortgage it, and then they can't repay the amount, so they sell it. So they were the people who were selling gold. Well, of course, when the gold recovery took place, it was, well, people like us and those above us in the class status who were buying gold for the fancy weddings that they were conducting. Anyway, so I would just point out these two things. We need to broaden our scope of analysis if we want to see how to be able to really not just how to design a policy for a recession and how to come out of the recession somewhat better. Otherwise, what we're seeing is we're going to have a huge increase in inequality as we come out of this recession. Thank you. I would just say, Nagesh, one point. Just sorry, I was a bit late in getting to the in joining in.
No, not at all. Professor Devanathan, I think you have added additional insights to this very vibrant discussion that we have had this afternoon. You have highlighted how for micro enterprises, basically this is a default option for those who lose jobs in urban areas, and then this urban-rural connection, and looking at the households beyond enterprises. I think these are very important points for for our future work. We need to keep in mind, and this important point that you emphasize on the social security dimension. I think we need to create a architecture which provides for social security of anybody in the very large, pervasive informal sector that we have in India, which sustains a very large proportion of our workforce, 86%, as much as 86%. And we need to have a comprehensive social security mechanism to address anybody's falling in a stressful time. So I think on that note, let me open up the discussion, because we still have 8 to 10 minutes for any hands that are being raised. So I see a couple of hands. Professor Yeram Raju Behra. So you have the floor, please. And I have some of my colleagues raising hands. I will come to them later. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Professor Nagesh Kumar, Mr. Akhilesh, and the erudite speakers who have enlightened on various aspects. I represent Telangana Industrial Health Clinic Limited. This is the only institution in the whole country which has been established for revival of the manufacturing micro and small enterprises. The mandate is very clear and limited. This is a government established company at my instance, and we work more on technology only. And here I may say our experience, both inside the pandemic and outside the pandemic. See, majority of the schemes that have been announced by the government have reached larger among the small and the medium because of the clubbing of micro, small, medium enterprises. And that is why I have requested for wider thinking and action in terms of keeping the act specifically to micro and small enterprises, so that the budget also will be allocated to them exclusively. Second, I fully agree with Professor Balasubramanian when he said that the change in the definition has impacted the sector very, I would say, adversely for the micro enterprises and also for the really small enterprises. Now, some of the micro enterprises have already become zero on account of this change in the definition. They don't now attract the attention of the ministry at all. If you see the national draft MSME policy put on the website of the ministry, it is really highly disappointing. The entire discussion that went around, concentrated on a few states, only 5 states, and all the countries in the world have been cited as the incentives that have been given post-COVID, where we don't find any comparison to the type of incentives that our country had given.
Yeah.
Thank you. What I'm going to make very quickly is that in terms of revival of the enterprises, there is a scheme known as subordinate debt or providing equity for these micro small. Nothing, not a pie had gone to them. The second thing that we have noticed among the 220 enterprises that knocked our doors, I'm talking of 100% of 220 enterprises. All these enterprises have clearly told that whatever assistance that the banks had chosen to give under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan Scheme 1 has really helped the banks more than the enterprises, because banks have been able to reduce their NPA portfolio, impending NPA portfolio in the segment. These are some of my observations related to the post-pandemic study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Behra, for first of all for sharing with us this information about this revival clinic. Very good initiative, and also for your insights. Now I have a hand raised by Sangeeta Ghosh, one of my colleagues, and anybody else who is trying to take the floor, please let me know or raise the hand. So Sangeeta, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and for the insightful discussions that followed. My point, I just want to make one point really, which is on the presentation that was made by Dr. Akhilesh, which is just that one of your conclusions pertains to the fact that a majority of the enterprises you surveyed saw the revision made as a benefit. Now, given the fact that the sample has quite a few large firms that have now become medium firms, and medium firms that have now become small firms, and actually, as you yourself mentioned, that your survey is not really representative to the micro firms so much, So given that, I think such a conclusion, I wonder if really any erstwhile micro firm would agree to that perception of firms seeing the revision as beneficial to the now defined enlarged MSME, because as has been brought out evidently from the discussions, it is the most vulnerable that have been neglected, even with reference to their pre-existing vulnerabilities as well as during the pandemic. And it is important here to stress that the MSME sector is a priority sector for a reason. It gets certain benefits from the government, most importantly, the public procurement of PSUs. They procure not from the large, from the medium firms, but from the micro and the small firms. Now that the large have become small and the small have become the micro, this has a huge impact on the little market access that was available to some of the smallest of these of this, not the sector perhaps, but whatever, of the MSME universe, if you could say so. So it really has a big impact on that aspect, as on the credit guarantee scheme, because it is again the larger ones that can access the newly interested credit guarantee. I think this needs to be really stressed enough. It cannot be stressed enough that this enlargement of the universe at this point of time might not be as beneficial. So I'd like you to look into that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see another hand being raised by Anjali Tandon. Anjali, you have the floor. Hello, Anjali.
Hello,
Please.
sir. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I was muted. Apologies.
Yeah.
Thank you. So my question is actually addressed to either of the three panelists, Professor Devanathan or Professor Keshav Das or Professor Balasubramanian. The point that echoes across the conversation is that we are missing out on data for a representativeness of the micro enterprises. Very well taken across the board. But if we were to have the data for micro enterprises, typically the ones which Professor Devanathan happened to mention, those street vendors and maybe similar of the kind, what would be a mechanism to have it? How do we roll out a census of micro enterprises? I mean, if you could share your views, how can we actually put this into implementation, put this into effect, to actually have a system in place to have data for micro enterprises? Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. If there are no other requests for floor at this stage, I want to turn to all the four speakers and give them 1 minute each for any concluding thoughts or any responses to any of the questions. So beginning with Akhilesh and then over to the other speakers in the same order. Akhilesh,
Yeah.
go ahead, please. 1 minute each.
Yeah, sir, there is one question in the chat box that any differences in COVID impact between Dehradun and NCR MSMEs. Basically, in general, the MSMEs has faced a similar kind of challenges, but given their differences in activity, like the Dehradun, they have the tourist-related activities and other. So that's why there is some differences in there. But in detail, we have not studied it, but sectoral differences is there. Other question by the Sangeeta. In my presentation also, I mentioned that the increase of the population of MSMEs is basically marginalizing the unincorporated enterprises and micro enterprises, and the small and medium enterprises are availing the benefits. But see here, this is the definition, and there is a long demand of the MSME that there is revision of definition of benchmark should be increased, but increase in the turnover criteria. So now in this case, it has happened. Basically, revision is not affecting. The issue is that how you are targeting the enterprises. Suppose that in the population, more numbers are coming, but the question is that the large section is not registered. They are not willing for coming forward for the registration. So this is the problem. They are not coming for the formalization. Government is not willing to address them. These are the other challenges. Population is not the problem, and categorization is not the major problem, what I feel. But yes, of course, for this junction, increasing the size is definitely it will affect the access, their access. So 30 seconds. Anjali's question that about the census. Basically, the census, the MSME census do cover the micro enterprises. The unincorporated non-agriculture enterprises survey do cover the micro enterprises. The question is that how frequently we are doing it. As Professor Balasubramanian mentioned that every 5 years we need to do the surveys of MSME so that we can get the timely inputs. So this is
good. Thank you, Professor Keshav Das. Is Professor Keshav Das around? Seems to be not connected at this moment. So let me go over to Professor Balasubramanian.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to make a concluding statement stating that I strongly believe that MSMEs are certainly to bounce back. However, a helping hand from the government to accelerate the process of bouncing back will do good for the country. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Professor Devanathan.
I would also just make a brief statement in response to Professor Tandon's question. I'm not a data person. I don't know how you can collect, how you can have a system for collecting all the relevant data. But I would say that at the policy level, what is needed is a system of universal social security, irrespective of who the person might be, where they are located, etc. I mean, initially, for instance, even with regard to the distribution of free food grains, they tried to have various things about, oh, you must have a ration card and so on and so forth. But I know there are lots of informal workers in the government industry who just don't have ration cards. I mean, they come from UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, etc., and they don't have ration cards. So you just have to give. Finally, the policy that was implemented was whoever comes for food will get food. Whoever comes and asks for food grains will get it, because other people will not go. Those who don't, you and I will not go and ask for those food grains. We have it at home. So it needs a universal social security policy if we have to deal with what are going to be recessions in the future also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very important point to conclude this debate on, that we need a universal social security kind of framework, which is also encapsulated in the SDGs adopted by 193 countries around the world. And that is the most sort of enduring solution to the pandemic or any other external shocks affecting the vulnerable sections of society. So social safety nets are meant for taking care of such situations. And they can also play the role of, generate a counter-cyclical measure. So when the chips are down, the demand is down, they create the aggregate demand and they protect the vulnerable sections. So I think MSMEs and particularly micro parts of that are very vulnerable sections, and they would really benefit from the creation of an architecture of a universal social safety net in the country. I think this is the direction we need to move towards, and that would only cover and address the future challenges like the one we are passing or are coming out, hopefully. So with that, I want to really thank all 4 of our speakers of this afternoon. And I emphasize on this point that this is an ongoing engagement and dialogue that we need to sustain on some of these issues. It is not a one-off kind of discussion which we need. And so we will remain in touch with you. We will remain engaged with all of you, and will continue and gather the insights and make proposals to the government to take forward and address the situation and build an India that we all aspire to build. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.